Hello everyone. Today we're going to wrap up engines. We talked about harmonics in the last video, and we used a sort of a simplified model. And in that simplified model for reasonable values of the rod ratio, there really weren't too many vibrations at a high magnitude past the secondary harmonic. What I want to talk a little bit about today first is what happens when you use the full model we did previously in the class, the force model. Um, and then we'll talk a little bit about characteristics of different kinds of engines. So shaking forces, that's something we talked about previously, and you can use the model we made for the internal combustion, for the crank slider mechanism and force analysis to actually plot the XY force and the shaking moment. So what we did last time was we did that simplified model and we're looking at just the acceleration of the piston. Here we're actually looking at the forces on the engine block and the moment on the engine block. And these are the forces that are actually going to cause the shaking. And we can do, to look at the frequencies of these things, we can do a fast Fourier transform and get the frequency domain information on this. So this is the magnitude of the vibrations at different frequencies for the shaking force in the x direction, which would be the main direction of the piston it's moving, the y direction, which would be perpendicular to the axis of the piston, and then the shaking moment. And what you'll see here is, harmonics down here, you can kind of ignore the numbers on it, but essentially this peak right here is at the running frequency of the engine. So this is at the running frequency of the crankshaft here. So that would be the primary component. This next harmonic would be the secondary, and you can see that the X shaking force has this really huge peak on the primary frequency, and what that is the piston. As the piston moves up, it's pushing the engine down. As the piston moves down, it's pulling the engine up, and it's a really strong vibration in the X direction at the frequency that the crank is running at. The Y shaking force, that's all going to come from the connecting rod moving back and forth. And again, it's very strong at the primary, but not near as strong as the X, because there's just not you're slinging a lot of mass with a piston moving up and down, or in this case it's left and right. In the X direction, we modeled that left to right, but you could easily rotate the graph and make that X-axis up and down. But in the direction that the piston's moving, that's where most of the mass is being slung around. That's where most of your shaking force is. The Y direction, you get a little bit there too, and that's the center mass of the connecting rod moving back and forth. And you can see why the model we made last time, where we just dealt with the piston's acceleration, why it's not bad. It's because this dwarfs pretty well everything else. But if you want to do a really good job, you need to look at everything else. So, and then at the secondary level here, you see both these things drop off quite a bit. There's just not a lot at the frequencies of twice that the engine's rotating speed. The biggest thing it peaks there is the shaking moment peaks there at the secondary. So that's why we care about that. Then the tertiary here, or ternary, the ternary, there's still a little bit of shaking moment there. The X and Y forces started. Y is just basically not an issue. There's a little bit of the third order harmonic, and then you get to higher harmonics. There's still a little bit in the X force, but this shows that that's not a bad assumption. What we did last time, just looking at essentially the X shaking force, and just looking at the first and second harmonics. So again, not bad. So primary and secondary. It's not bad, but we could go ahead and take what we've covered in this class and go ahead and model all these higher order harmonics here. But in general, we pretty well only care about the primary and secondary. So engine speed and twice engine speed. So talking about specific kinds of engines, the single cylinder engine, the simplest kind of engine, they're hard to balance. So the biggest problem on this is you've got a piston that's going up and down, and you don't have anything that counters that. So the engine's going to want to hop. When the piston goes down, the engine's going to want to hop up. When the piston's going up, it's going to push the engine down. So the engine's going to want to hop up and down in the opposite direction of the piston motion at any given time. And so there's a really huge component of X shaking force in a single cylinder engine that literally the only way to fix it is to put a mass on the other side that's moving in the opposite direction of the piston up here. And when you've done that, you've made a two-cylinder engine, or a really poorly designed single-cylinder engine with a big eccentric weight. If you're going to go through all the trouble to put a mass that's moving in the opposite direction of the piston, you might as well make it a cylinder too and make a two-cylinder engine. So with singles, there's not a lot you can do. The crank, you can put an eccentric weight on it that rotates down as the piston goes up. That helps a lot to have a counterbalanced crank. But still, there's only so far you can go with that. So a static balance of the crankshaft and part of the connecting rod mass helps. Secondary, there's nothing you can do. Well, you can. Yeah, so the big on secondary is the connecting rod moving left and right, and the Y force, the connecting rod moving left and right. You can make it so that the crank counterweight is on the right side when the connecting rod's on the left side, and that can help a little bit in the Y shaking force. So you can help by some counterbalancing on the crank, but it's really hard to get perfect primary. Getting perfect primary and secondary, it's not really an option in this. So you're just going to have to live with vibrations, especially that primary X shaking force. It's just really hard to do anything about that, or at least completely eliminate it. So singles are usually limited in their size and RPM. So you'll see in like four-wheelers and some motorcycles, you'll see 500, 600 cc, maybe some 700 cc singles. They exist, but the RPM they can run is relatively low without shaking. You either have to live with the shaking or you don't spin high RPM. So in things like motorcycles and ATVs and side-by-sides, you just don't care that much about the shaking. They just shake. It's part of it. You wouldn't put this in a car for a lot of reasons, but it would be a very unpleasant experience to have a really big displacement single-cylinder engine running at high speed. It would be very harsh to drive. So you just kind of have to live with the shaking forces on singles. Inline engines, when you start stacking up cylinders in a line, for even firing order, which even firing order versus odd, even means that the cylinders are going to fire with an even number of the same number of degrees between them. So like an inline 2 4-stroke engine, there would be a cylinder that fires every 360 degrees if it was even fire. An inline 4 even fire, there'd be a cylinder that would fire every 180 degrees of crankshaft revolution. 180 times 4 gets you the 720 degrees for a cycle. A V8, there's going to be a cylinder that's every 90 degrees. An inline 8, an even fire would be every 90 degrees too. A V10 for even fire would be 72 degrees, but V10s start to get a little weird, and you might not be able to, because you need the crank throws here where the connecting rod mounts, you need those to be in the right position so that the cylinder's at top dead center when it fires. So there's only certain geometries that work, and for some things like V10s, there's not a lot of good options for making. I mean, you can make an even fire V10, but they're a fairly sophisticated thing to do. I think you need to have a 72-degree bank angle on that. I can't remember off the top of my head. But there's some engines that it just makes sense to do odd fire, where there's a different timing between exhaust pulses. So like for a 2-cylinder engine that's odd fire, you might have maybe 540 degrees between 2 cylinders, and then firing, and then have whatever 720 minus 540 is, 280 or whatever. That's not right. Anyway, I can't do math in my head right now. But you might have different angle between the firing of cylinders, and that's what an odd fire engine is. But for even firing orders, the pulses are evenly spaced. So for an inline even firing order engine, which you want for most inline engines, you want an even firing order. Your shaking harmonics cancel except those that are multiple of number of cylinders divided by 2. So a 2-cylinder engine, 2 over 2, it's not going to be primarily balanced. A 4-cylinder engine, 4 over 2, you're going to have primary balance, but you're not going to have secondary balance. For an inline 6, you're going to have 3 or 6 over 2, you're going to have primary and secondary balance, but not ternary balance. But again, we don't really care about that. So inline 6 has good, perfect, really theoretically, primary and secondary balance, which is why you hear about inline six engines being good and being perfectly balanced. It's because they're perfectly balanced. You can perfectly balance them in the primary at the speed the engine's running at, and secondary at twice the engine speed's running at. So a straight six is pretty well the simplest engine to get perfect primary and secondary balance. It's a good engine. You know, for even fire, it's a good engine. It really is. They're very smooth. Uh, they're very they're just good. It's a good engine. The downside of a straight six is they're really long and they're really skinny and they don't fit an engine base very well. So you see these in some smaller displacement straight sixes in some sports cars, especially rear engine sports cars. Sorry, front engine rear drive sports cars. You see these in big like semi trucks and big diesel engines like that because they do run so smooth and you can fit them in an engine bay. But you know, something like you start to get big, they start to get so hard to fit in the engine bay of a like a sports car, something like that, or sedan. So there's some companies like BMW. This is a BMW engine. They go crazy about straight sixes and just do a great job with them. You know, Toyota's got some really good straight sixes, or in the past anyway. Uh, you know, Ford and GM, I believe Ford had a straight six they put in pickups for a long time. It was like 4.2 liters, something like that. I can't remember. Uh, you know, GM's experimented on and off with straight six engines. It's a good engine design. Again, you get good primary and secondary balance for the fewest cylinders you can get for that. Twin engines, V-twin, you can get primary balance with 2 crank pins, but it's probably going to be odd fire. Higher order balance for secondary, you're going to have a balanced shaft that spins at twice the engine RPM. So any engine that's not inherently balanced in the secondary harmonic, you really have to have balanced shafts if you want perfect or close to perfect balancing on that. So split pin V-twins that are odd fire, like Harley engines are odd fire. There's a different amount of time between. It's like, so one cylinder firing to another is going to be a lot longer than from this cylinder going back to this cylinder. And so you get a very characteristic exhaust note. The Harleys are known for this. The Harley sound is because they're odd fire. And so you don't have an even spacing between cylinder to cylinder and timing. So you get kind of an interesting harmonic on top of it. It's like sound. The sound is just it's sort of an interesting sound harmonic versus just the even firing engine. V4 I don't have in here. It's pretty rare. It's rare. There's not really good advantages on it. It's basically straight twos, which we've already inline two engines. We've already talked about an inline two is not going to have primary or secondary balance, so it has almost no good features from a vibrational standpoint. And just slapping two together to make a V4 doesn't make it that much better. You know, you just kind of have two of them that are offset by whatever your bank angle is. So the package is kind of nice because it's somewhat of a square of V4, but not common. The weird things like V5s, yeah, you can do, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. There's been some weird stuff like that in the past. V6 is sort of the jack of all trades engine. It's essentially two inline threes stuck together. So if you go back to this, an inline three would have 3/2. You really don't. You start to get better balance of the primary, but you don't really have primary balance, and you don't have secondary balance for an inline three. So you put two of these things together, an inline three is on a bank angle, and that doesn't mean you magically solve these primary and secondary problems. So the issue with this is you're going to need with the V6 is you're going to have, it's going to be better than an inline three would be, but it's still not great from a primary or secondary moment perspective. So you really need large balancing weights on the crankshaft, two of them, two large counterweights on the crankshaft to get the primary moment, or a balanced shaft to get the secondary, or both. So it depends on how big these things get, and that's sort of a limiting factor on V6s. V6s don't get very big in displacement. Once you start pushing past 3 or 4 liters of displacement in this, this vibrational thing starts to become more of an issue, and you don't really see them. There's some weird applications for bigger V6s, but it's pretty rare to see a big V6 nowadays. There's just not a lot of real reason to do it. But for 3 to 4 liters, the vibrational characteristics are manageable. They're a nice form factor for putting in a longitudinal or transverse mount engine. So for a front engine front drive or a front engine rear drive, it packages really well either way. Fits in an engine bay well. It's fewer parts and simpler than a V8. It's sort of a compromise engine. It's one reason I don't particularly like V6s that much, is because it's really just a compromise engine. You know, it's basically you didn't quite want to go full V8 with something, or you didn't want to deal with the packaging problems of a straight six. So you just compromise and run a V6. So there's some really good V6 engines out there. Nissan makes the VQ engines. VQ, I think they're VQ. I get my VQs and VKs. VK is the VA. VQ, I believe, is the V6. And they put in all sorts of stuff. And there's other really good V6s out there. It's not a bad engine, but it is a compromise design. Cross-plane V8. So there's two good ways of doing a V8. There's cross-plane and flat plane. Cross-plane, if you look down the axis of the crank, there'll be crank throws rotated at 90 degrees. So looking down, this will look like a cross. So there's 4 pins. Each pin has 2 connecting rods. You need a 90-degree bank angle for this to work. Otherwise, you're going to have to end up with an odd fire engine. So 90-degree pin offsets, you're only going to have an unbalanced primary moment. Unbalanced primary moment you can solve with counterweights. So you'll see these 2 eccentric weight systems, these 2 big heavy counterweights that are offset 180 degrees. That solves the primary moment. Secondary balance you'll have very easily. So just with some counterweights and kind of a heavy crank, but with a heavy crank you solve your moment problem, and you've got an engine that's got very good balance characteristics. So and you don't have to worry about balance shafts. You can make these things as big as you like. I mean, they do make these things big. I mean, they make, in automotive applications, they make 7-liter V8s. They used to make even bigger than that. You know, in racing, you can get 8-liter, 9-liter, 10-liter V8s. They scale up. They can run at high RPM. You know, a big 426 Hemi can run 7,000 RPM. Big block Chevy can run 8,000 RPM. But they're good engines. They're, from a balancing perspective, the only compromise is you need a little bit of a heavy crankshaft, and that might limit how fast the engine's angular velocity can change. So it might make it a little sluggish on accelerating. Not really on accelerating. It's mainly in changing RPM, like when shifting, or in a racing application where you want every last bit of acceleration. And you don't want to be spending a lot of your engine power accelerating your crank mass. Maybe there's some benefit in having a lighter crankshaft. But from a balancing perspective and a sound, as we'll talk about later, it's really good. It's straight six is inherently a little bit better balanced. You have a little bit lighter crankshaft, but you got to deal with the form factor of a straight six, where it's really almost a 50% longer engine than a V8. So these things still are mostly square. They fit in longitudinal and transverse mounting applications. It's just a really good design. That's why it is a thing. That's why V8's a thing. It's a really good design. Flat plane V8, this will be an up, down, down, up crank. Still 2 connecting rods on each one of these journals, but they're rotated by 180 degrees here. This has the balance characteristics of 2 inline 4s. So 4 divided by 2, that gets us a primary balance, but not secondary balance. So V8, flat plane V8s, you'll still need a 90-degree bank angle for even fire, and the biggest problem with this is that secondary vibration. And so you either put a balance shaft on it, or you have to just deal with the vibrations. So this sort of limits how big these things get. You know, classically somewhere 4-ish to 5-liter displacement. These things, flat planes are a deal. Ford sort of pushed this to 5.2 liters. Supposedly GM's working on a flat plane for the Corvette, the new C8 Corvette. I think it's like a 5.5 liter mainly, and that's going to be a screamer of an engine. But the 5.2 Voodoo engine that Ford makes and puts in the GT350, that's a flat plane V8, and it's a screamer. So what's the main advantage of this? Really, from a mechanics perspective, your crank can be a little bit lighter than the crossplane. You don't need these 2 really big counterweights here. So you're theoretically your crank can have a little bit less inertia, and your whole engine can rev up and down and change RPM quicker and be a little more responsive. As far as making more power, the main advantage in a flat plane is when it comes to exhaust tuning. And we'll talk more about that when we get to sound. But in a cross-plane V8, you're always going to have two cylinders on a bank next to each other, fire sequentially. So it's like bang, 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 bang when you fire it. So it, getting the left and right bank exhaust pulses merged together to get proper scavenging is more of an issue on a cross-plane V8, whereas in a flat plane, it's bang, 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 bang. And so it's really easy to design exhaust manifolds for flat plane, and maybe you can get a little bit better scavenging on it. They sound a little bit different too, depending on how the left and right banks are merged. Uh, but that's one advantage the flat plane has, like a real performance advantage. From a mechanical perspective, there's really not any power advantage other than maybe the crankshaft can rev up a little freer. Honestly, it's really, if you do things right, it's mainly sound is the difference. And even then, you can make it so the sound's not an issue. So there's not as much of a difference as people would sort of be led to believe by how much hype gets put around flat plane engines. Uh, but there's some things you can do with them to make them sound different and really cool. Uh, and there's some truth to them revving a little freer and higher. But a lot of it's hype. But there's a couple things that these are can rev a little bit more freely, and they without doing a lot of tricks on the exhaust, they sound really kind of cool and unique. We'll talk more about that when we get to sound. V10, it's going to be two 5-cylinders stuck together at a bank angle, so 5 divided by 2. We've got primary balance, and we're starting to get somewhat closer to secondary balance, but it's not secondary balance, right? If we had a V12, 3 divided by or 6 divided by 2, we're primary and secondary balance. That's great. So we're not quite there on a V10. So you're going to have a secondary problem, which means you need a balance shaft or you need to limit the size of the engine. There's two different designs. There's one where each cylinder has its own pin on the crankshaft, and there's some where they're shared. Some of the shared pin applications where there'd be 5 throws on the crankshaft, 5 pins for 10 connecting rods. You're going to get odd fire, and these things will sound bad. The V10 that Dodge put in the Viper for a long time in some pickup trucks, it doesn't sound very good compared to some other V10 designs. Split pin V10 sound really pretty cool. The F1 V10s sound pretty cool. The odd fire V10s have a very kind of interesting harmonic to them that can sound really, really, really neat, like the old F1 engines. So V10s have sort of a reputation for sounding cool, and a lot of it's just lots of cylinders, and lots of cylinders means more bangs per minute, and more bangs per minute sounds cooler. But again, with some odd fire, you can get some interesting harmonics, or with how you're merging pulses from the left and right bank for an even fire engine, you can get some interesting harmonics, and that's a lot of what makes an engine sound good. And there's two things that make engines sound good. It's how many bangs there are per minute, and then past that, it's interesting harmonics. And V10s can have some interesting harmonics, in a good way and interesting in a bad way, depending on how the exhaust is set up and how the crank's designed. V12s, that's 2 straight 6s in 2 different banks stuck together on a common crankshaft, so it's going to be better than a straight 6. Straight 6 is pretty good, so a V12 is going to be really good. Downside of a V12 is you've got 4 more cylinders out here, so your part count goes up, complexity goes up, cost goes up. The engine starts to get really long, and you're sort of limited in what you can package it in. So you see V12s in like some extremely high-end street cars, like a Lamborghini makes a V12, BMW made some V12s, Mercedes made some V12s. But outside of that, it's super high-end luxury cars and super high-end performance cars and some race cars. And then big diesel engines like train engines and stuff will be V12s or V24s or something like that. But balance-wise, they're fantastic. They just start to get a little complicated and expensive. So sound. So single, again, I wish I could show the videos. This is sort of a compromised way of delivering this lecture. compared to the way I normally do it in class. So I highly recommend pausing and opening these videos in a new tab and listening to them. So this is a 2-stroke single versus a 4-stroke single. So the main difference, so in a single cylinder engine, it's inherently even fire. So there's going to be a bang every 360 degrees for a 2-stroke and a bang every 720 degrees for a 4-stroke. And it's even fire if the engine's running halfway decently. So the single cylinder noise, the only thing you get in it is bangs per minute. That's the only thing you can really change past tuning of the exhaust pipes and any kind of resonators or mufflers or things like that. And I don't want to talk about that. That's a musical problem. That's a musical instrument problem. Is the design of the exhaust pipes and mufflers and that. That's not anything to do with the actual why one engine sounds different than another engine from a mechanics perspective. That's musical instrument tuning. So I'm not going to talk about that at all. I don't know anything about that at all, other than some very basic stuff. But as far as just engine mechanics go, what you can do in a single to change its sound is spin it faster, or go 2-stroke versus 4-stroke. And in general, the more bangs per minute you have, the better something sounds. An engine at 7,200 RPM sounds better than an engine at 3,600 RPM. It's louder and it's a higher frequency, and it just perceptually sounds better. So if you think about 2-stroke versus 4-stroke for a given displacement engine and a given RPM, a 2-stroke is going to have twice as many bangs per minute, and it sounds, conceptually like twice as good. It's hard to put, numbers on things like that. But yeah, it's twice as many bangs per minute, it's going to sound better. So when you hear a 2-stroke for a similar power level versus a 4-stroke, the 2-stroke engine is going to sound like it's spinning at twice as fast of RPM. Even though it's not. They might be spinning at the same RPM just because there's twice as many bangs per minute. It sounds like it's spinning twice as fast, and it sounds better. So 2-strokes usually sound better than 4-strokes, all things being the same. Again, anything past that is tuning of the exhaust pipe. It's not anything to do with the geometry of the engine. Inline engines, a lot of them are going to be even fire, except some of the weird 3 and 5 cylinders. So even fire engines, like an inline 4, even fire engine, it's going to be a bang every 180 degrees on an inline 4 even fire 4-stroke engine. And so there's not any interesting characteristics to an inline 4. All 4 cylinders are going to get merged into one pipe. So there'll be one bank that goes into one exhaust pipe in most applications. And really the only thing you can do with an inline 4 to make it sound interesting is just spin higher RPM. So the higher RPM, usually the better things sound. So like 4-cylinder motorcycle engines that rev over 12 or 13,000 RPM, they sound pretty cool. That's just because of the RPMs, though. There's not any real interesting characteristics to an inline 4. A boxer 4, which is a flat 4 where you have two inline 2 engines that are phased 180 degrees apart, where the pistons go towards each other and away from each other. That's what a boxer engine is, and you can find animated GIFs of this online. It's still going to be even fire. You're still going to get a pulse every 180 degrees. What's different in a boxer is you've got 2 banks, and with 2 banks, you can change how those 2 banks get merged together and get some interesting sound. You can either not merge them and have 2 tailpipes, and then you get some stereo effect where you get a bang on one side and a bang on the other side, and a bang on one side and a bang on the other side. Or you could get it where it's bang bang on one side and then bang bang on the other side, and you can get some character. You can merge them together with unequal length tubes, and you can get some harmonics from doing that. There's things you can do when you've got 2 cylinder banks. Now, could you take an inline 4 and do that as well? And basically create virtual banks by merging 2 cylinders together and then merging 2 other cylinders together and then changing how they. Yes, you can do that. I actually have a race car that has a 4-cylinder inline 4 motorcycle engine, an R6 Yamaha motorcycle engine, and it's got an exhaust like that where the left 2 cylinders are banked together and the right 2 cylinders are banked together, and then they're not merged. And it sounds really cool. It sounds more like a boxer engine would sound like, even though it's an inline 4. So then it's not a good setup at all from an exhaust scavenging standpoint, but it sounds pretty cool. And then boxers usually, and they have a little more character because of the way you can merge banks together. It just makes sense to do that on a boxer. It's just easier because you already have 2 banks. You got to do it anyway. Inline 5s and inline 3s, you might have odd fire, and in an odd fire, you're going to get weird harmonics from that, and they might sound cool. And in the case of inline fives, they actually sound surprisingly cool for something that has a few cylinders. Inline threes, actually, some of them sound pretty cool too, because of the harmonics on them if they're odd fire. If they're even fire, which I don't know if you can do, I'd have to think about that. It'd be a pretty weird crank to have an even fire 3 and 5 cylinder. But again, I don't know if that's possible. I'd have to think about what that would even look like. I don't think it is. But 3 and 5, you're usually odd fire, and that means interesting harmonics. That means interesting sounds. So, like an inline 5 has a lot of interesting harmonics that a inline 4 doesn't have. So they can sound pretty cool. They sound like half a V10, really. So you don't get the bangs per minute you get with a V10, but you get some interesting harmonics on them. So they sound pretty good. Inline 5 is kind of a cool engine. Now, from a vibrational standpoint, they're not good. They're a compromise between a inline 4 and an inline 6. It's like when you want a little more than an inline 4, but you don't want to go full inline 6, you do an inline 5. Inline 6, it's even fire. The only thing interesting an inline 6 has is the bangs per minute. There's no characteristic sound to a straight 6 that a straight 4 doesn't have, other than 3 over 2, 150% as many bangs per minute for a given engine speed. So, but you're getting to the point where for reasonable engine speeds, there's enough bangs per minute that it sounds good. So inline 6s usually have a reputation for sounding good. They sound smooth. There's enough bangs per minute that they sound interesting for a reasonable RPM. So, essentially an inline 6 is going to sound like an inline 4 at 8,000 RPM. An inline 6 at 8,000 RPM is going to sound like an inline 4 at 12,000 RPM. That's the best way I can explain it. And that's the difference, because it's an even firing order, right? There's no interesting characteristics to it. They're all going to get stuck together in one bank and out one tailpipe, and you might split it out to 2. You could do some weird stuff with grabbing 3 and then routing it in one bank, and 3 and routing it in another bank, and that's all tuning. Geometrically, mechanically, it's even fire. The interest is going to come from the fact that there's more bangs per minute. V engines, V12, V twins. If you have a odd fire, you're going to get some interesting harmonics from that, but the bangs per minute aren't there. So that's the Harley sound. It's low bangs per minute, but very interesting even fire. Kind of the timing on it. V4s, again, weird engines. You're not going to see that many of those. V6s. V6s don't sound very good in general. You can make a V6 sound good. Some companies have done some really good things making V6s sound good. V6 engines just don't have a reputation for sounding good. And the problem is you've got 2 banks here, and it's a lot of how those are merged. And so some companies do a better job of merging those banks together, and some do a worse job. Probably the best thing to do would be to have to have 2 separate headers and keep the pipes separate, and then a little bit of a crossover from scavenging, and try to keep it sounding like 2 inline 3s. That's probably about the best you can do with a V6. If you just merge all 6 of these things together with equal length tubes, it's going to sound like pretty much like an inline 6, but it's the packaging on doing that's a nightmare. So what you normally see on these is a pretty simple header. These are usually used in somewhat economy cars. So you'll see 3 go together, and just a real short tube header, or not even a header, just a simple exhaust manifold, and then those kind of stuck together, and you don't get good merging of the pulses, and they just don't sound good in most applications. You don't get the bangs per minute of the higher cylinder counts, and you don't get any kind of interesting harmonics. And if you do a bad job of it, I don't know. It seems like a lot of V6s just don't sound that good. Some do, like the Nissan VQ engines. I actually like. Some people hate those, but they at least have a characteristic sound. So again, it's not that a V6 sounds bad. It's just that a lot of people are kind of lazy with them, and it's hard to make them sound great. But you can do a good job, you can do a bad job with them, and there's unfortunately a lot of bad jobs with V6s. It's sort of the compromise engine on sound. It's the compromise engine on vibrations and packaging. So It has its reputation for a reason. Oh, that's right. I didn't mean to end that slide. Let me go back. V8. Okay, so V8. I talked a little bit about this cross-plane V8. You get a firing on the left bank, left, right, right for the usual firing order. And so sometimes you get 2 pulses on the left bank sequentially, sometimes you get 2 pulses on the right bank sequentially. Now, if you took all 8 cylinders on a V8 crossplane and you ran equal length tubes all together into one collector, it's going to sound like an even fire. It's going to sound like a flat plane V8. It's going to sound completely indistinguishable from a flat plane V8 if you do that. In fact, you can get on YouTube and find videos of people that have done that, where they've made an 8-into-1 collector header where they're all 8 tubes the same length that come together into one. And it sounds like a flat plane, right? Because you've got 8 pulses coming one every 90 degrees out of a single pipe. And as long as the tubes are the same length, they arrive. There's no timing, phasing differences, and it just sounds like a continuous stream of pulses every 90 degrees. And RPM would be the only factor, and it sound basically indistinguishable from an 8-cylinder, from a flat plane. They make good power. The scavenging's good on that, but the packaging is usually a nightmare on trying to make an 8-into-1. With 2-bank exhaust. It's a packaging. You see it on boats where the packaging is easier, but in a car, it's a giant mess doing that. Some race cars they called them the bundle of snakes headers that did that, but passenger cars, it's hard to do that. So what you see a lot on crossplane V8s is you'll see dual exhaust where the left bank and right bank will be mostly separate, and they might merge in a little bit just for a little bit better scavenging with like an H or an X pipe. But the banks are pretty well separate, and that ends up having a stereo effect where you get a bang bang on the left, and then later on you get a bang bang on the right, and that's the classic American V8 burble, is when you've got dual exhaust, maybe with a little bit of crossover, maybe no crossover. From power, you should want a little bit of crossover, but for sound, no crossover, true duals that don't actually connect at all. You're going to get that really good stereo, difference between the left and the right side. It adds some interest. It kind of sounds a little odd, fiery. It's the classic American V8 sound. If you do what they do a lot of times on pickup trucks and merge the left bank together with the right bank through one pipe, but you don't do that with equal length tubes in the left and right, you get usually fairly garbage sound. I know my truck was like that, and it just doesn't. It sounds okay, but it doesn't sound as good as it could with proper duals or proper equal length left and right. So that's something that, again, a lot of that's in the tuning of it. But with a crossplane V8 and dual exhaust, it's got a very characteristic sound. The flat plane V8, you're going to get left, right. It's just bang, 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 bang for 8 firings per every 2 revolutions. And so with dual exhaust or merging them all together, they sound basically with dual exhaust, you basically get a bang, 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 left, right. Merging them all together, you're going to use evenly spaced pulses out one pipe. So they sound smooth. It's characteristic of a flat plane. They just sound smooth. You get a lot of bangs per minute. So that's where a lot of the character comes from in a flat plane. Is just the bangs per minute, which is it's going to be the same as a cross plane. It's just smooth as opposed to having the sort of burble that a cross plane would have. V10s. Usually odd fire, or you use some interesting bank merging things, and you can get characteristic sound on those. I personally think the V10 sound the best of all engines, just because they do have some character, and you do have a lot of banks per minute in a V10. So that combination of character and lots of banks per minute makes them sound really good, in my opinion. Some people like other engines better, but to me, nothing sounds like a V10 at high RPM. So the Lexus LFA, just absolutely amazing street car sound. The VW Group's V10 that they put in the Audi and the Lamborghini, that engine sounds amazing. The F1 V10 cars from the late 90s, 2000s, early 2000s, those are the pinnacle of engine sound in my opinion. So again, some of that's linked in this video here. I highly encourage you to watch these videos. But a lot of it's lots of bangs per minute and character. So I keep doing that. I need more slides. The V12 is it's smooth. And lots of bangs per minute. So the only character in a V12 is usually the banks per minute on them, so that they just screen. V12s have lots of banks per minute, and they're even fire, and essentially you can get some stereo with dual exhaust on it, where you get left and right bank firing that might make it a little more interesting. But they're fairly smooth. They don't have the character that a V10 has. And then once you get past that, really that V12 is about as high revving RPM engines go. And then you get past that, you start getting into weird stuff or rare stuff. The Bugattis, whatever their W16 engine is, uh, or that thing's got so many turbochargers on it, you can't hear it anyway. The train engines like V24s and stuff like that. Who cares about sound on a diesel that's only spinning at 1800 RPM? He's talking about diesels. I haven't really talked about diesels that much. All modern big diesel engines have turbos. The ones they put, like the 6.6 and 6.7 engines they put in 3/4 and 1-ton trucks, those all have big turbos on them. And most of what you hear is turbo noise with some clatter from the diesel. And they don't. Some people like them. I don't. I mean, I own one. I don't particularly. I like it quiet. I haven't modified the exhaust at all on my diesel truck because I don't really particularly like the diesel sound. I like the torque, but the sound is not that interesting in a diesel. They're just a whoosh from the turbocharger usually. And some people love it. Some people, I'm not a particularly huge fan of. Turbocharged engines are always sort of muffled and kind of mushy sounding compared to just a naturally aspirated engine. To me, a naturally aspirated V10 is about as good as you can do on sound. And I think a lot of people would agree with me if they really start listening to the different cars. So anyway, that's it on sound. A little low on slides. This is a lecture that's much better when I can do it in class and show videos continuously. So I really hope you took the time to watch some videos on this. So that's it for engines. And then I will see. So Monday we're going to be doing the exam review. Wednesday next week will be the exam for those of you in class, and then the Friday next week will be the final exam review. So really this will be the last content lecture for the class. So that's it. Thank you all.